Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 513. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're excited to have with us the internationally acclaimed and highly talented children's book author, Melanie Hill. Melanie.
Hello, Barney. How are you? That's a wonderful intro.
Well.
I'm gonna play that to myself a few times, I think.
So this is the thing. So you're here to talk a little bit about. You just had a book that came out, or is it coming out now? It's out.
No,
now.
It's out. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Jett Cooper.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That
Jett
sounds
Cooper,
amazing.
And you can just see it slightly in my. It's just
there
behind me. Oh, there it is. Yes. Yes. Jett Cooper. Yeah. It's a middle grade story. So for 8 to 14-year-old readers, about a 14-year-old boy called Jett Cooper who wants to be an aerobatic race pilot. It's super exciting. I've worked in aviation for most of my adult life, and there aren't a great deal of books for kids about aviation and flying, especially fiction books. There's a lot of there are non-fiction books, but I thought it's time that kids have something about flying where the child is actually, or the kids are actually flying and doing the aerobatics. So yeah, and I love the cover. It's so beautiful and it's so bright, and it gives you a very clear sense of what's going to be in the book and in the story itself.
So how was it to write like action sequences of flying? I'm completely intrigued by that.
Well, it actually took me a long time to work out how to write those action scenes. And what I eventually did is I just kept watching video footage of the what was the Red Bull air race at the time. So we were right in the middle of the Red Bull air race sort of popularity when I was writing the book. So I would just watch those videos all the time, and what I started to do was narrate them to myself. So I would talk about what I was seeing on the screen, and I would try to do it at the right pace of when things were happening in the video, so that I got a real sense of when they made turns, when they rolled, or when they did snap turns, where they were going through gates or around chicanes. And so that took me a little while to work out the best way to get that sense of action and immediacy in the flying. And through the book, because I'm aware that I have to introduce the audience to the race course and to the flying terms and what's going on. And I've got a protagonist who has to get better throughout the course of the story. So the chapters that have flying in them in the beginning are a little bit longer because there's a little bit of exposition that goes with that. But at the same time, the character is still getting familiar and learning and readjusting and getting familiar again with being in the cockpit and flying. But as the story goes on and the flying gets faster and the competition gets more to the final scenes, the flying scenes then get faster and the narration gets shorter and it gets more immediate as we go through. So it took a long time for me to work out how best to do that, and then to build that and layer that into the story as I was writing it.
Now, so why middle grade for the story instead of like a YA book?
Because as a child growing up that was fascinated by flying, I would have loved at that age group, at that age, to have had a book like this that I could read. And so I really thought about who my target audience was and what I would have wanted as a 8 to 14-year-old. And so that's why I chose middle grade. because there are a lot of kids, especially at that age, that are fascinated by the world in general, but then also flying. And it's surprising how many kids love flying at that age group.
Right. Now, as you said, because you spent years around aviation, and what detail did you absolutely insist that you had to feel true on the page?
Well, that's a really good question, because it's a very technical world. And I'm not a pilot myself, but I've been involved in aviation for my career, especially I was in the Air Force and now I work for Boeing. So I am not an engineer, I'm not a pilot. But it's a very technical world. And I enjoy that and understand that to a degree. So having the technical parts of that world included in the book was very important to me, because the people that I work with and that I'm around who are in that world, it's important to them. But at the same time, I didn't want to make that a barrier for people to enjoy the book. So I had to really balance the technical parts of being in aviation with it not excluding people from enjoying the story and starting to enter that world and starting to understand that world. So there's a lot of I don't go too deeply into aerodynamics and the theory around aerodynamics. I do keep it at a very surface level, but I hope at a credible level, so that people who are familiar with that world recognize it and can go, yep, she's got that right, but not to the degree where other people will go, well, that's just way too difficult for me to understand.
Well, then I guess, is there one flying term or concept that you personally love that most people don't understand then?
I just love the fact that aircraft move in 3 dimensions. So they roll, they pitch, and now I've got to get this, and they yaw. So they operate in 3 dimensions, and each of the flight control surfaces maneuver and change and allow the pilots the ability to operate in those 3 dimensions. And so you have to be able to think in that 3-dimensional way when you're flying. And so that's something that I've always found super fascinating and that I have included in the book. And because of the nature of the flying that Jett does, you have to be able to include it and understand those just 3 very I won't say basic principles, but there are 3 core principles of how the aircraft moves through the course and the things that he is conscious of when he's flying. So if his nose is down, his pitch, or he needs to pitch it up, all those sorts of things. They're the parts of flying that were important to include for me, because I find them quite fascinating and you need to understand that if you want to understand how the aircraft moves through the course.
Well, hey there. If you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep this show going. We love hearing from you, so any feedback is welcome. And thank you for being a part of our podcast family and for all your support. It truly means a lot to us. Now, so Jett's mom bans flying after his dad's accident.
Yes.
What did you want readers to understand about her fear?
That as an adult, that comes down to the grief. Like there's a theme of grief and dealing with grief through the novel. There's a couple of other themes, but I really wanted people to understand that everyone experiences grief differently, and that our responses to grief are sometimes shaped by our age. And so from the mum's point of view, she has lost her husband, her world is in chaos, and she doesn't want to lose her son to this, or her son. She doesn't want her son to share the same fate as Jack, her husband. And so she experiences grief as an adult, whereas Jett experiences grief very differently and has a very different priority about how he wants to keep his father's memory alive and what that means for him. So in some ways, the way they experience grief is different, and it puts them in conflict, and they need to resolve that conflict and need to come to an understanding that their experience of grief is different and their response to that grief is very different. And so it wasn't hard for me to imagine the mum's response, to her husband dying in an aircraft accident. That was very easy. But then I really had to think about, well, if I was a 14-year-old boy who went flying with his father, and I felt close to him and his memory when I was flying, that is how I would want to remember him. So I had to think a little bit more about how Jett experienced grief and why that would be different from the way that his mum experiences grief.
Now, so how do you write grief for kids honestly without overwhelming them then?
That's another good question. I think I just wanted to be really honest about that. And while I have not experienced the loss of a parent, my parents have, and my extended family have dealt with grief quite extensively. And I have lost friends as an adult in flying accidents. So I just wanted to be very honest with that, and also not shy away from it, because I think it's important for kids to understand that these things can happen, if not to them, to friends of theirs, but not have it in the story in such a way that it was I'm going to say negative experience. That's not what I mean. Of course, it's a negative experience, but there is a way to deal with those things eventually, that you can celebrate somebody's life. I think is really where Jett's coming from. He wants to keep his father's memory alive and celebrate the experiences that they had together. So that hopefully comes across through the book, and it's not a bogged down, depressing story that focuses on what he's lost. It just deals with it in an honest way, and there's a focus on being close and remembering his father in a way that is true to the things that they enjoyed together when they were flying together.
So how do you balance? So talking a little bit about the pace of the book. So how do you plan? How did you plan on when you balanced like the cockpit action, and then like the quieter like home scenes? How did you plan those out and balance those out?
Well, I think I gave the story. Well, I created the world is built in a competition. So the
Mm.
competition lends itself to certain events happening, races and progression through the competition. So once I understood that myself, then I had to plan sequences leading up to those races, because there's things that happen in the races that then are either the culmination of what's preceded that or then lead into the next sequence as well. So with the racing in the competition as really clear markers in the sand, then I balanced out the rest of the story around those points of racing. So the competition is a great structure to have in the novel for that very reason, because the closer you get to the race, the faster the tension goes up, and then as you're coming out of the race, it drops a little bit, although there are consequences out of racing events. But then Jett as a character needs to think about the things that have happened in the race, and so then it lent itself to quieter moments or scenes with a slightly slower pace in them.
Okay.
So
Now,
it switched
so
from action to internal stress. Sort of, it was really thinking about those types of things and balancing that out.
okay. Now, what's your like 'cause as an author, what's your personal rule for an action scene on the page then?
Oh, I don't know if I've got a personal rule. I think it has to be, well, one of the things that I look for, and one of the people that I read as my go-to is Anthony Horowitz in terms of action scenes. So he
Okay.
writes the Alex Rider series. So his action scenes in Alex Rider are pretty good. And then
Mm,
he's written multiple others. He's written James Bond. He's been part of the James Bond Trust and written James Bond novels to continue that storyline. So his action scenes are really good. So if I think about it, my rule would be if I use the same techniques in terms of sentence structure and action as he does, then I'm on the right path. I would not say I would be the same as Anthony Horowitz, but if I use him as my guidepost, then I'm on the right path.
mm. And so how do you talk to kind of on the same thing we were talking about earlier, like how do you talk to kids about risk then in a way that kind of respects their intelligence then?
Um, I think you just be upfront about that, and it sort of ties into the reason why the accident happens so early on in the novel is because it puts the
Mm,
stakes right front and center of the story. That particularly with flying is there is a lot of risk involved, and if things go wrong, they can go catastrophically wrong, and they can result in the loss of life. But inherently, there's a lot of safety and a lot of precaution that goes into aviation that mitigates and prevents that. So I think if you put the risk up front and talk about the consequences and then show how you can be safe and eliminate a lot of that risk, that's a really good way to talk to kids about that.
mm,
But and aviation and the aviation industry itself is inherently risk adverse. Despite doing something that is extremely risky, they are inherently risk adverse, and flying safety is really important. So, talking about the safety aspects without scaring people, I think, is a really good way to approach that. Because, yes, if something catastrophic happens, that's a risk that we live with every day, like crossing the road um, has an inherent risk in it. And when things go wrong, there can be a catastrophic outcome. But if you're taught that if you look both ways, you make sure that it's safe to cross, then you're teaching children that that's risky, but you can mitigate that risk and still get across the road safely. So it's that same sort of approach is, yes, something can go wrong, but if you do all these things right, then the chances of that happening are really small.
mm. So what would you say then is what's your favorite aircraft fact that you're dying to share that the kind that like kids like to the kind that kids will probably repeat at dinner?
Oh, well, I suppose it's a story that more
Okay.
so than a fact, right? That there's an aviation museum in New Zealand just outside of Blenheim, and it's focused and based on World War One aircraft. And Peter Jackson from the Lord of the Rings, the director from the Lord of the Rings, owns that and has a fascination with First World War aircraft. And he has a company that builds the replica aircraft that are in this museum, and they build them to spec. So they have the plans and they build them as close to the originals as possible. Either that's with materials or with design principles. And this is a long lead in, I know, but but in that museum, one of the first aircraft that you come across has wings on it with no moving parts. And what it does is it flexes. So the wings, with the rudders flex. They don't have flaps or ailerons or anything like that, and the wings flex. And I love that idea because it is close to watching birds fly as you can get. And if you look at that aircraft, you can see how, and it's fabric covered, so you can see how the wing works, which is really different from anything else. And then later on in the same museum, they have a similar aircraft, and they tell the story of a New Zealand, I think he was a New Zealand pilot, where the aircraft, something happened to the aircraft, and so the pilot had to get out of the aircraft, and he flew the aircraft by standing on the wing. And so he's airborne trying to land this aircraft that's incredibly damaged, doesn't have a lot of control over it, but something happens where if he stands outside of it and tries to operate the cockpit from external, like on the wing, he'll be able to land that aircraft. And so I find those two things, those two stories, really fascinating. About the flexible wing to start with, and then the fact that someone had to get outside of the cockpit and land a plane by standing on the wing. That's super fascinating.
So, Melanie,
that's not what you were expecting, was it?
That was a good story, though. If people want to learn more about you and your work, where is the best place they could go to?
Oh, the best place is my website, which is melaniehill.au, and you'll see there's links there to to obviously Jett Cooper, which is my first novel, but also anthologies that I've been involved in speculative fiction, and also children's anthologies as well. And I also write poetry. So if you go to the books, then you will see poetry and short stories that I've had published and been included in anthologies.
This is going to be your first young adult novel. It sounds like you love writing this genre, huh?
Oh, I do. Yes.
Yeah.
And I've got Ella Teo is one of the characters in Jett Cooper's story, and she has entered my head and asked for her story to be written. So I am writing her story next, and it's not a sequel. It's like a parallel story. So It starts at the end part of the events that happen in Jett's story, but it then goes on it sort of peels away and goes off and talks about her, what happens to her after the Blue Wolf Air competition. So yes, I've started writing that now. So yeah.
Then you'll have to come back on and talk about that book then.
I will. That'd be great. I'd love to do that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Melanie. I had a pleasure talking to you.
No, thank you for having me on, Barney. It's been good fun. So, and I'll come back on anytime. Just let me know. Okay.